Uh, oh yeah. Oh baby, so beautiful. Having a great time, and the weather is beautiful. I think the rainy season started. I want to talk about this. Like 3 days ago, it was calm, cool. Suddenly, there was I think, Force One hurricane just came blowing down the street.
Right. And I blew your hat right over into your face so nobody could see anything on your face or eyes. Yeah, no, it's the beginning of the rainy season. I had totally forgotten about this. That's the thing about, these places where you have any season, right? Even in, say, New England, while it's winter, you forget that it's ever summer and it's ever warm and it's ever nice. And then it arrives and you're like, you can't remember that it's ever cold and ever like snowy, and that it could be, a more difficult situation.
Right. So there's the dry season, then there's the humid season, and then boom, like the rainy
Yeah.
season announced itself with force.
Well, actually, people tell me that that was unusual, that it's not usually like that in April, that doesn't usually come for another month or so. So this was early onset of,
Early onset rainy.
yeah.
But it was beautiful. I mean, it was stunning and gorgeous and unexpected, and like having a hurricane just blow down the street. And it was really exciting. And so it kicked off this whole week, which was another exciting week in El Salvador. So much is happening in El Salvador. The world is coming to El Salvador. Good news is happening in El Salvador. Cuba Plus is happening next week. You can talk about that later. But like a couple of other great stuff happening.
First, I want to say, like, I was thirsty and there's like no water in this. Just so you know, this is a fake prop right here, basically, because there's actually no water in it. No, I wanted to mention that this guy, Peter Zion, or Zay, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but it begins with a Z or a Z for our British audience out there. And the thing is that this guy has been given the, airtime on Joe Rogan's show, and he dissed Bitcoin. And now, cut to a few weeks later, he is on his own YouTube channel dissing El Salvador. So it's interesting that there is this sort of, Bitcoin is El Salvador is Bitcoin, President Bukele is Bitcoin, Bitcoin is President Bukele, that there's this like these emerging sort of groups of people that they do defend the status quo. They are paid well in fiat and US dollars. And there's like, they find ways, a lot of this hate from the US democratic media sorts has emerged because of Bitcoin, because President Bukele has adopted Bitcoin for El Salvador.
Yeah, the fiat mindset.
Yeah.
The fiat mindset. And we see it in the Bitcoin bashing, and we see it in the El Salvador bashing. So I saw this guy, Peter Z, on his YouTube channel, made the rounds on YouTube. And he just makes categorically, provably false statements, but he does so in a very dramatic kind of, he's like the movie, The Sound of Music. You remember Julie Andrews is out in the field singing, the hills are alive with the sound of music. There you got Peter Z. He's walking around the meadow somewhere singing provably false intonations like the hills are alive with my bloviating lies.
Well, the lies he was telling was, he was, of course, concerned trolling El Salvador like much of the media does, and much of the status quo, just as President Bukele wrote on the cover article in Bitcoin magazine, where he said the status quo is against El Salvador. This is the fight for the future of humanity, he had said, that because they don't want Bitcoin to succeed, because Bitcoin is about individual sovereignty. It is the end of the kingmakers. It is the end of them getting to print money and determine who gets to do what in the world. So he said this, he predicted this, and he described what he was witnessing. And now every day we have another headline about that. So just recently, there was a Swiss newspaper that published a headline suggesting that it was bad that El Salvador had paid its debt somehow this is bad because, whatever, they come up with blah, blah, blah reason, it doesn't matter. But all the headlines from months before then had been El Salvador is about to default. That's why we have to downgrade them. That's why we have to raise the cost of their credit. That's why we have to force their people to suffer. All of those things because they're going to default, and it's horrible and it's bad. And this proves that President Bukele's gamble on Bitcoin has failed. And then he didn't default. El Salvador didn't default. And they didn't say, oh, I guess that means that we were wrong, that in fact, Bitcoin did help them succeed and blah, blah, blah. No, they came up with him paying off the debts is a bad thing. So they did that. And here, Peter Zion says, well, President Bukele ending the gang situation, the gang occupation of half of the country, many people, millions of people were under occupation of these foreign gangs, really. They're US made gangs, they're made in California. Anyway, he says that by President Bukele locking them up, that he will create mega gangs that will become the political party of the future.
So that gets into the provably false statements this guy is peddling. To your point there, the idea that paying off debt is somehow a bad thing, right? So the paid media, the corporate media, they're able to take an issue like debt, and depending on the propaganda needs, they just flip it and polarize it to fit their propaganda. So in one case, in the U.S., for example, if the U.S. paid off its debt, it would be the most glorious, sensational story ever, covered by Bloomberg and Forbes. But the fact that El Salvador paid their debt is construed diabolically, diametrically in opposition to anything that makes sense as a bad thing. And since they have a monopoly on this media, there's nobody really to challenge it except in the alternative media. And then when you say that Joe Rogan, seemingly in this particular issue, he just seems to be completely on side with the status quo. I'm not sure what that's about.
Well, of course, the empire governs differently than past empires. So past empires used to send their galleons, their fleets of ships, control the sea waves, and occupy nations, send conquistadors, violently kill the population, install their own ruler, and then steal all your gold and your resources. The empire today is an empire of debt, and that is the servitude. So, of course, paying off debt means that you're one step closer to freeing yourself from debt servitude. And, of course, Bitcoin was the signal that this was coming, like the mindset. They could see the disobedience in this person who is the leader of this country, that they could see that he would be disobedient and not continue to take more of their debt. So this is what triggered the wave after wave after wave of basically violent headlines, because these are violent because they are pretty much a soft act of war. They're trying to destabilize through bad headlines.
Right. So the president of El Salvador, Najib Bukele, is offering to its citizens individual sovereignty. I mean,
Yes.
let's not be unclear about this. That's what Bitcoin offers, individual sovereignty, which is, of course, as you point out, that means that it's no longer within the control that other countries who have fiat money and soon to be central bank digital currencies would have an excessive amount of control and surveillance all over their population. So he's bucking with that whole notion of corralling the population into pens of totally controlled, really, objects from the centralized government and the centralized bank. He's freeing the nation, right? So it's economic freedom. I made this very important diagram. I don't know if you can see it, but this is my representation of the human brain.
It looks like a brain.
Yeah, there we have it, you see? And I could design emojis. So the brain is the frontier whereby this war is taking place, the info wars, as somebody once coined. And so the info wars in the brain are where this battle is being waged. It's not, as you say, the galleons are floating around, and it's not territorial because the territory around the globe is pretty much all kleptocratically wrapped up. It's all about now what's between our ears, and that's where the war is taking place. And so that's where the ability for this guy to go on YouTube, Peter Z, and say provably, diabolically, diametrically wrong things, but with such confidence and such, alacrity, that it fools a lot of people, I think, into thinking that he's saying something noteworthy instead of just spewing propaganda for the war machine. Remember, fiat money is war, Bitcoin is peace.
Well, definitely his delivery is one of utter and absolute confidence. And I mean, a part of that confidence is having, FU money behind you, right? He feels, just like Paul Krugman can declare with utter confidence that, the fax machine has no future whatsoever. The internet has no future whatsoever. Whatever, I guess it was the internet that he said it was going to be as important as the fax machine. And he could deliver that with confidence because he genuinely believes that he has all the FU money behind him, that he has the empire's back, that he is defending the guy who, well, as Paul Krugman said, that the dollar is better than Bitcoin, Paul Krugman said, because it is backed by men with guns. And he believes those men with guns have his back. So that's why he delivers these with complete confidence. But the fact is, unfortunately, Bitcoin has revealed a lot. And this is what you're seeing with these people. They still have the confidence. They're like Baghdad Bob. Many people in the audience might not remember 2003, but in the invasion of Iraq, there was that guy Baghdad Bob who was the spokesperson for Iraq. And the thing is, it was funny because he delivered his speeches to CNN and whatever, he would be a guest on those shows. They would, he would deliver these totally confident thing. Is like, no, we have smited the U.S. Marines came in and we've killed several thousand of them today. And he was so confident that you were like, are we hearing like wrong information from our side? Like, this seems like the guy seems...
He's totally believable. He's the Billy Mays of war propaganda, Baghdad Bob. And here's Peter Z, who's the Baghdad Bob of the Salvador propaganda, anti-El Salvador propaganda and anti-Bitcoin propaganda. But that confidence that comes to be able to speak publicly and confidently lies it comes from having no empathy, right? You have no empathy in your soul. Your soul is dead.
It's just racism. It's pure racism. He says, like, the reason why he said El Salvador will turn to mega gangs is basically, he was saying it's in their character. And it's in their character because, look, you fellow racist Americans who are listening to this, that his audience is like, the New York Times or Washington Post reading or New Yorker reading audience that he has. What he's saying to them is, remember, these people are savages. They had a dictatorship through the 80s. Which is like true, but who the hell installed that dictatorship? The United States, okay, and backed it and armed it and weaponized it. Like that it's, but he was saying that this proves that they're savages essentially. And then he said, then they had all these gangs that emerged out of that system of these sort of savages that would have a dictator here. And you're like, no, those were freaking sent to us here by you in California, like your audience that reads the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. So
yeah, so you have a guy who, I guess you make a comparison, let's say, to George Wallace. George Wallace in the 1960s was openly racist, and he was a politician who was taken seriously and got a lot of support, but his platform was to be openly racist. This is during the civil rights movement. So here you got, as you described it, and I saw the video, Peter Z, he's openly racist. Now, we live in an era where every microaggression is answered by marches and placards and movements and campaigning. And, this person needs to be protected because they think that they're a butterfly. And if you're a butterfly apologist, an anti-butterflyist, you must be deplatformed. Okay, so like a little microaggression, really from the back burner of someone's psychotic mind, is being given incredible protection by the state. Here you have a guy who is base racist, right? Like the most, like George Wallace level, in your face race baiting, and everyone's like, like Joe Rogan. I mean, if Joe Rogan doesn't call this guy out, I'd have to say, well, what are Joe Rogan's feelings about this race baiting, right?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I like the butterflyist, but the fact is that what they're against is freedom and liberty, because whatever they say, just understand it's the opposite. They said over and over and over that El Salvador would default. They said it. There are thousands of headlines. Anybody out there does not need to trust what I just said. They can verify for themselves by going to Google or any search engine, search and see what they said. They said, they promised you, they told you that El Salvador would default, and it didn't. They told you that Bitcoin would cause a disaster here. And instead, where did the disaster happen? It happened in the United States. It happened with FTX. It happened with all those very doubly, triply, highly regulated New York entities in the crypto space. Like, all of the disaster happened where they live, and that yet they had the audacity to sit there and point over at the guy who chose the independent one. That's why they're so angry, because, the IMF, for example, the IMF is not against countries like El Salvador or Argentina or anywhere else in the developing world from adopting crypto. They're against them adopting Bitcoin in particular. So they don't mind if you have an oligarch at the top. Most of the oligarchs, the owners of the tokens of the 22,000 shitcoins, most of those people are, American or European. They're one of those people who are, their skin colors and their nationalities are acceptable to the New Yorker and the New York Times and the Washington Post sort of reader. So they're the right pedigree to rule the currency. With Bitcoin, obviously, nobody can control it. Not President Bukele, not President Biden, not you, not me. Well, I have
special gift.
I have a special gift of the fairy godmother.
Yeah, you have a very special gift. Very special gift. And but we'll get into that at some point. But, to kind of follow up on this, President Bukele has part of his job is incredibly easy. As he said in his essay for the Bitcoin magazine called "Don't Drink the Elite's Kool-Aid," we should read it if you haven't read it.
He said, "Stop drinking the
elite's Kool-Aid." And then he did another interview where he specifically went into, I think it was with Tucker Carlson, how the elites essentially are, the disaster is coming from within. The problems in the U.S. are not from external attacks; they're from inside.
Yes.
So, like this guy Peter Zion's a great example. He's inside the U.S. and he's stoking racism and aberrant behavior. And this is interesting in terms of El Salvador would default, because what I've learned on Wall Street in my many years is that the markets tend to reflect more of the reality of the situation. And if you look at the emerging market index for debt from all the countries around the world, the single greatest performer in 2023 is El Salvador. So again, it's one of these situations that I always hate to see. The average Joe on the street who watches mainstream media wouldn't consider something like El Salvador debt because they're being told it's a disaster. But the professionals on Wall Street who don't listen to mainstream media know that this is probably an excellent opportunity to make some money. And that's another way that the insiders typically can aggregate an excess quantity, and there's a huge concentration of wealth through the propagandization, through their controlled media outlets, in a way that make the average person really, really unaware of the market realities.
Well, a few months ago, maybe 8 or 9 months ago, last summer, maybe, we had dinner with a guy who runs a hedge fund and manages a lot of sovereign wealth. He's somebody that people would know. His name, his family name is, he's very famous. But he manages like some massive sovereign wealth funds. Parts of, there's no one manager of these sovereign wealth funds. There's like they give a lot of money to various private equity and hedge funds and stuff like that. So he manages some of the most famous of the sovereign wealth funds. And his specialty is emerging market debt. That's what he specializes in, debt of emerging markets. And so he has traveled all around the world to many parts of Africa, Latin America, to, go do the due diligence and look and see what the situation is. And when we had dinner with him, he was just like, he's a young guy. He was like 30s, early 30s. And he was like, I've never seen anything like this ever. He said, like all the countries I've been to, he said, all the countries that we invest in, my desk is, there's always a lot of negative headlines about the countries that we invest in because they're emerging economies, and maybe there might be like inflation or corruption or, defaults and stuff like that. But he had never, in all the countries he's visited, and he said there were many, many, many dozens of them, that he had never seen such a gap between the headlines and the reality on the ground. Just even from the point of just arriving at the airport and driving into San Salvador, like it was that he couldn't even reconcile the two, that they were so vastly different from each other that he didn't understand how this had emerged.
Yeah, I think the comment was made, it was like finding a Fabergé egg at a garage sale.
Yes.
In amongst, the tchotchkes for $5, here's a Fabergé egg called El Salvador, which is worth gazillions of dollars. And at that time, I remember the conversation, and I remember kind of looking at the markets, and I believe the debt was around 40 cents on the dollar. I checked recently, it's more like 80 cents on the dollar. So
I think it was even less than that. Remember, it was something like 28 or 29 cents. It was like really low.
So it's almost a triple from that conversation.
Yeah.
And of course, he's an emerging debt specialist, and this is why you become an emerging debt specialist, because the market tends to misprice things where the cost of due diligence is very high, because you have to actually go to these countries and you have to get on the ground. And due diligence is really almost absent from all kind of research today in these markets. And we saw that in the FTX scandal. Every single participant in the FTX scandal never did a lick of due diligence. They simply, except for Taylor Swift.
Oh, yeah. That's an interesting story. Taylor Swift is, it really exposes a lot of everything that we've seen around us in terms of the crypto space. And that is that here's a woman, and it also shows you and explains having virtue. Like, virtue is hard work. It's hard work to, not be greedy, for example. She was offered $100 million by FTX. And even somebody worth $10 billion, $100 million is hard to say no to. All you have to do is send some tweets and do a video or two. And she said no. And the reason why she said no is, she asked a simple question. And she said, are all of these things you list on here, they seem like unregistered securities? And she's a pop singer. It's not even like a rock and roll sort of like John Lennon guy, sort of singer. She's like a pop singer. And yet she asked the one obvious question to ask. And none of those guys on CNBC who are pushing FTX, none of them, Scaramucci, Novogratz, Kevin O'Leary, none of them asked that question. And so she was asking, she was concerned not about, the sort of people who watch, the sort of people who buy the New York Times or Washington Post. She was concerned about her audience, like the people who are, have maybe $1,000 to their name. Like, does she want to encourage them to buy an unregistered security? And many of them pump and dump scams, as, FTT was that token.
Well, what you're bringing up here is an excellent point. There was no due diligence. The people like the Novogratz and the Scaramucci's and others who are in the business, who should know better, who have licenses that proving that they've done some of their own accreditation and that they have knowledge of how these markets work, never asked even the simplest of questions: are these unregistered securities? And what we know from that group of folks is that they're bottom feeders. So there's literally nothing that they won't do for a penny or a nickel, which gets back to your virtue idea. Yeah. So here's a woman, a Taylor Swift, who's a pop singer, very successful, who's a very virtuous woman who looked at that $100 million, but asked a very simple question: are these unregistered securities? And the answer to her what she heard, obviously, was that the answer didn't give her any comfort. Whatever the answer was, she did not believe it. And she's completely avoided the scandal. And it's just amazing. It's as you say, it's revealing. It's revealing so much. You see, we're saying how Bitcoin is revealing. And here it has revealed that Taylor Swift is a virtuous person, and those other guys are bottom feeding, not virtuous people.
Well, so I'm going to read this again. I've done this before because it's quite interesting. And if you read, just Google it, verify for yourself, go do some research, because, these are interesting ideas going back to ancient Greece that developed in a different period of time when the money wasn't so easy, perhaps. So people actually had to develop things like virtue, and they really contemplated what was a great republic or what was a good person. They really thought and contemplated on these things. We have ancient Greece that still holds to this day, thousands of years later. Like, those are the philosophers, the foundation of our philosophies to this day of what makes a good person. So you could see the yin and yang, as, say, Nozomi Hayes would talk about the pole of good and bad, the lightness and darkness. And it's never like absolute, like there's no perfect person. You struggle all the time with the opposite of the virtues, which are the 7 deadly sins and the 7 heavenly virtues, or the cardinal virtues, however you want to call them. But, the virtues are chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility, and they oppose the 7 deadly sins of wrath, anger, greed, sloth, pride, lust, envy, and gluttony. So any human is naturally going to have to, if you're offered $100 million, you want that $100 million. And they say you have to sell these unregistered securities to your audience. So most people, all those people we named that appear on CNBC who are allegedly already billionaires, at least on paper, if they could dump their tokens, right? So they go on CNBC and they've told themselves some sort of lie to overcome their knowledge that what they're doing is wrong. They know it somewhere, but they justify it with the money.
You say something there. You kind of glossed over it. I want to get into it. You're like talking about ancient times, ancient Greece, when these concepts were first developed. You say when money wasn't available. Okay, that is correct, because when you have a fixed amount of money available, and it's not a fiat money system where trillions are being printed to encourage this type of malfeasance, you end up having to develop values and things that make a character and a person virtuous, for example. And that's what's missing from today's environment. I mean, it's all summed up essentially with, say, Dina Moose in his book, The Bitcoin Standard, of course, talks about low time preference. And this is the idea that you're willing to give up instant gratification for a bigger payoff in the future, right? And so what we have today is people who are pushing FTX and the people you mentioned, they have extremely high time preference. They just want cash no matter what. They have no consideration whether it's legal, moral, ethical. They don't think about it. They just want the cash right now, and they're dangerously out of control.
Yeah, but as Frederick Bastiat, the great statesman of France, had pointed out in the 1800s, this is the nature of man. This is the nature of human society. And you could verify it for yourself by looking at history. We plunder and slaughter. That's what we do. So how do you govern? How do you operate as a society? Because, okay, if there's 7 billion of us on Earth, like, can we each have our own 100 acres of land and stay away from everybody else? Do you know what I mean? Like, we have to live together. But how do we do that when everybody does have, like, the tendency to want to avoid pain, as Bastiat said, and it is a pain to work, and it is we'd rather just stay at home and lie in bed all day if we could just take it from somebody else doing the work.
Yeah, totally. It is the nature of man. And what happened 2,000 years ago or 2,700 years ago is that you had concentrations of the population in the polis, which in Greece, which became the word of politics. And as a result, the idea of how to govern more equitably was developed, and we have the beginning of democratic ideals. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, the fact is that everything in nature and everything in human experience and everything in the cosmos is governed by some set of rules, right? Governance is not completely obviated in any instance at all. There's always some kind of governance mechanism, and it brings us back to Bitcoin, which is the perfect governance mechanism, which gives us perfect money. And to get back to your previous point, when you have the presence of perfect money and perfect governance, it's revealing. It's revealing because these guys used to be able to hide in the shadows of mass kind of crime waves without any yardstick to use to reveal exactly the nature of their malfeasance. With Bitcoin, it's really hard to hide when your character is infecting you in a way that's destroying any ability for equitable governance. And so this is, again, what Bitcoin here in El Salvador has ushered in the Bukele era, where so much is happening that's so positive because the yardstick of perfect money and perfect time preference is bringing about this kind of, as you point out, this Renaissance-like thinking.
So again, I'll go back to what I was saying in terms of this structure, and that is that, as Bastiat pointed out, the norm, 99.99% of human beings throughout the history of the world have wanted to plunder and will plunder. A person like President Bukele is a very, very rare exception. So that is why we have struggled for centuries, thousands of years, to come up with republics and constitutions and laws and, separations of powers, executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, like trying to govern the fact that we're going to fuck each other, right? Like that's what we're going to do. We're going to steal each other's shit, and that's what we need to stop. But always, eventually, you pay off the judge, you pay off, the president of the United States, whatever's going on with his son and all that laptop and stuff on there, who knows? Like, who knows who's paying off what? But everybody knows something's rotten in Denmark, right? We all know it's corrupt. The thing about Bitcoin is that, as Nozomi Hayes, I go back to her philosophy and her ideas about how it takes that. It recognizes for a fact that humans are greedy and want to they plunder and take as much wealth as possible. So the protocol does invite that, pull it in, and turn it into your greed secures the network. It turns it into altruism, whether you want to be an altruistic person or not. It's assuming for a fact that you're not, that you're a greedy bastard, because that is the nature of man. So that is what it's bet on. So and the other thing that I wanted to point out is that Bitcoin embodies proof of work, right? And money in the time of ancient Greece was proof of work. You needed some work to get that money. So the proof of stake mindset enters into this equation, and we still have this sort of cultural notion that if you have a lot of money, you must be a hard worker and you must be worth it, rather than Paul Krugman and just spouting propaganda for the Federal Reserve. Like, that's why they create elaborate Rube Goldberg machines, whether it's around Ethereum and all these forks and proof of stake and doing that and doing this. And they pretend that they're all scientists and we're like PhDs and big thinkers and we're controlling this. And that's why we have FOMC meetings to pretend to like do the Wizard of Oz sort of magic. It's like, we are so smart. We have PhDs and we're like, we're doing this. We're working hard to maintain the value of this currency. And when the fact is, it's all a facade. There's nothing there.
Right. The prefix billionaire connotes a mastery and intelligence and that's some kind of superiority. So you'll see on the news, billionaire XYZ says this, but there's no context that, oh, well, he got to be a billionaire by theft, right? They don't tell you that he stole the $1 billion. Well, they just say billionaire.
But let me jump in there because we brought up Taylor Swift and Taylor Swift rejected FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried's money. So you can go and search for yourself and look and see what A16Z said, the Andreessen Horowitz crypto fund. They met with Sam Bankman-Fried and their notes are terrifying, that they were like, everybody knows that he was like a meth head, sort of, no, he was like addicted to Adderall or something. Like there's this notion amongst a lot of young people that they think they take this Adderall and it makes them smarter. So he was addicted to that. And everybody knows that. And he was spouting total nonsense and you could read it in their notes, but they were like, don't interrupt him. This man is a genius just because we don't understand him. And so it's like the guy is a nut job. That's why. And he doesn't know what he's talking about because he's making it up, because we know for a fact now that there were 0 records kept. He just took money and spent it and gambled it. That's the operation.
Well, Jerzy Kosinski wrote a novel or a novella back in maybe the 70s or 80s called Being There, about a gardener who becomes president of the United States, who spouts nothing but nonsense. Like, there'll be growth in the spring. Chauncey Gardner. We made a film of it, of course, with Peter Sellers. It's an instant classic. I recommend it highly. But this is the concept that if you spew nonsense, it's a ticket to vast riches because of the gullibility of those who are greedy.
Yes.
They want to believe you. It's a con game.
Yes.
That the con man plays on your greed and you sell yourself on the fact. Now, just to recap something or repeat something about Nozomi Hayes. So
Nozomi
Hayes is the alchemical nature of Bitcoin turning greed into altruism.
Yeah.
So the greed underlying our modern society seems to be leading to an extinction event, one might argue. And to be able to convert greed into people rushing into Bitcoin and rushing into mining as part of the game theory is an alchemical reaction that turns the energy into the hardest money ever in the history of humans and perfect money and creates perfect governance. So this is really a miracle on many levels, one could argue. And on the state level, you see what's happening, of course, in El Salvador.
I just want you to know, there was something driving me crazy back there, and it was a dry cleaning tag, and it had these staples that were like stabbing me in the neck and driving me crazy this whole episode. I was like, what the hell is that? And it was hurting me and scratching me and itching me. But those con men, like, that's the problem. That's why it's so obvious that, this so-called toxic Bitcoin maximalism, the virtues, the evil people who embody the deadly sins of pride, lust, sloth, gluttony, greed, all those shitcoiners, they act like proof of work. They act like virtuous people, like kindness. And so why we're so kind, we're so patient, we're good people. Like, they act like that. So they, the protection mechanism, the evolution mechanism of being toxic to protect yourself from a violent predator. These are violent predators because, again, read Bastia. They want to steal your Bitcoin. They want to steal your wealth. They want to plunder everything you have, and they will. That's the thing. It's like, Noor said something amazing. She works with Galloy, and you interviewed her a few months ago. And she said that no, Bitcoiners are not the neo-colonialists. We bring the gold. Colonialists that showed up in El Salvador, the conquistadors, they came to steal the gold, not bring gold. But that's what shitcoiners are.
Yeah,
They're colonialists. They're after the gold, which is Bitcoin. Because they just plunder it. We had to work hard to bring Bitcoin. There's no free Bitcoin to be sent out in some faucet anymore.
No, I mean, I believe during the recent prosecution or arrest and prosecution of Do Kwon, who was part of Luna.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay, it turns out that he was funneling all of his ill-gotten gains into Bitcoin.
Yeah. You were buying his shitcoin, Luna. And what would he do with it? He would buy Bitcoin. Thank you very much. That's the classic. That's colonialism. That's neo-colonialism. They convince you to send them your hard-earned money, and they convert it into perfect money for themselves and let you gamble with their tokens that they create out of thin air.
Right.
So
the toxic Bitcoin maximalist is really a defensive mechanism against this marauding predator class of shitcoiners and proof of stakers and fiat moneyers who are really just basically kind of predators.
They're predators. They literally kill you with kindness. And like we've already discussed this, but they are like, some well-known serial killers like Ted Bundy, who was a super sweet guy, super charming, nice smile, dead eyes. But he was like, he acted like a sweet, nice, virtuous guy. But in fact, he obviously wasn't a very good guy. And that's what these people are doing. They have to act nice in order to get you to trust them.
Yeah, the smiling clown, William Gacy, I think his name. He was a kiddie. He was a clown for kid shows.
Yeah.
And was a serial killer. This is, of course, the classic warning sign for you're about to get completely, pilfered of all of your wealth by this smiling salesman. It's a classic trope, right? In storytelling, the used car salesman, hi, buddy, how you doing? Come on in, right? So they have to be nice because they know that they're selling crap. Whereas Bitcoin, we can afford to be toxic Bitcoin maximalists because Bitcoin's going to do what it's going to do no matter what anybody does or doesn't do. It just does what it is. So we can be as toxic as we want to be.
Again, I just do it personally. I can only take care of myself. It's like that oxygen mask. And it's like, well, I know if somebody's really nice and sweet to me, my tendency is to be nice and sweet back. Like they didn't say anything horrible to me, like, hey, how you doing? Oh, you look great. Oh, I love that jacket. It's cool. You look good. And like, oh, thank you. That's really nice of you. And then they like take my shitcoin and give me your Bitcoin. Like as soon as you let them in, so it's not even worth letting any of those sort of people in.
It's like Count Dracula, and the smoke comes in the window, and then there's Dracula, and he's going to suck your blood.
Yes.
And it's like such a horror. It's a horror film. These shitcoiners are horror. They're a horror film writ large. And
not that any. You see some people on Twitter that are obviously like kind of new to this space, and they're bag holders. They're not the perpetrators. They're not the plunderers. They're not the ones that issue the tokens, but they are believers in whatever token they have because it's natural. You have to, like all Ponzi scheme bag holders always believe the lie they've been sold, right? Because they sold themselves. That's the point about Ponzi schemes, as you pointed out. So not that those people can't be redeemed or won't be redeemed when they get wiped out and then they get to pick up and start again. But at a nation state level, which is all I care about right now, like you can't do that. Like you end up a colony of whatever that token is, right? That's what happens if a nation state goes down that level. We see it with CAR, Central African Republic, and that was a great tragedy. And how do you escape that? There's no way. There is always a way, but it's going to be now a long and more difficult road out of that. They didn't even escape the French colonization of them now. They still have that stupid French currency, whatever, that they control all those African nations there. Now they have that and the Sango coin. Like how now you have two colonizing coins instead of just, Bitcoin, and then as a way to exit that colonizing coin of the French franc thing that they have to use.
Yeah, they had the flesh-eating amoeba eating their feet, and they introduced the Ebola virus for their brain.
Yes.
So that's their current state in the Central African Republic, due to the pernicious and ugly infestation of shitcoinery.
Yeah, who show up, they dress well, have a nice smile, nice guy, shakes your hand, listens to you. He's a billionaire. And what's this? The billionaire cares about
Billionaire.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah, if he could sell his tokens. But nevertheless, he's on the cover of all sorts of magazines and newspapers. The sort of people that read the Washington Post, New York Times, and New Yorker think, hey, he's like one of us. He's wealthy and well-educated. And look, he's paying attention to me. And I'm just the head of a third world country. And so he's smart. He must, because you have to work hard to get money, right? And so that's why you should be toxic instead. As soon as Taudera, the president of CAR, had declared Bitcoin legal tender, he should have just turned toxic
Instantly.
Yeah, he should have just become toxic because they're coming for your gold, right? Which is Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. Well, unfortunately, I'm naturally toxic and in a bad mood most of the time. So, me and Bitcoin are a good match. And Bitcoin maximalism has come along to catch up to my natural toxicity as just generally how I interface with humanity. And, before I forget, the latest edition of Bitcoin Magazine is dropping, I think, this week. And, of course, my column is in there. Check it out. That's something exciting. And what other excitement's happening before we sign off?
Well, it's definitely time to sign off because this starship is heading to Starbase 09.
Nice.
We watched the Starship take off.
Oh, wow. We've been on for a while. Let's do it.
I know. It's time to depart.
Say goodbye.
Say goodbye.
Bye, y'all. The hills are alive with the sound. Cut.